it goes further and wider than just an interest in another entity as we see it, an equity interest. It's any significant involvement that you have with another entity and how that impacts on your financial statements. Okay. The type of joint arrangement, joint operation versus joint venture. There's a lot of professional judgment required in that decision. So the assumptions, the judgments that you've made, have the relevant activities changed? And that is why I no longer control. That's why I no longer have significant influence or joint control, etc. Did I lose my representation on the board of directors, etc. Those are the things that I have to go and disclose so that the user can understand whether they agree or disagree with your assumptions. So that's point number one, and I think that's quite a logical one. If we go to slide number 2, information about interests in subsidiaries that enables the users of the financial statements to achieve those outcomes. All right, so I'll go through them one by one, just briefly. But what is important here? Interest in subsidiaries. Okay, now let's have a look. To understand the composition of the group, remember the term group can only be used when there's a parent-subsidiary relationship. Do you agree? Then, secondly, understand the interest that non-controlling interests have in the group's activities and cash flows. All right? So we want to understand who are the NCI parties. Have they been measured at fair value? Have they been measured at NAV at the acquisition date? What is their interest? What is their involvement? Give some more information about the non-controlling interests because they have an effect on the group financial statements. Evaluate the nature and extent of significant restrictions on its ability to access or use assets and settle liabilities of the group. So that's important, all right? So that speaks for itself. If there are any limits or restrictions, then such restrictions must actually just be disclosed in the notes to the financial statements in respect of the subsidiaries. Evaluate the nature of and changes in the risks associated with its interests in consolidated structured entities. So remember, these are consolidated structured entities. What are the risks? Why have we come to the conclusion that we should consolidate them? Do you agree? What are the risks? What is the involvement? What does it basically relate to? What happens in that consolidated structured entity, etc.? Provide more background information. Evaluate the consequences of changes in its ownership, especially things like loss of control, gaining control, loss of significant influence, loss of joint control, all of those significant events that are dealt with in IFRS 10 that were previously dealt with in IAS 27, paragraph 30, paragraph 34. So changes in its ownership interest in a subsidiary that do not result in a loss of control, and evaluate the consequences of losing control of a subsidiary during the reporting period. Now, can you see the words evaluate? Evaluate the nature and extent. Evaluate the nature of and changes in the risks. Evaluate the consequences of changes in ownership. Evaluate the consequences of losing control. What does that mean? The information provided must be such that the user can now gain a better understanding of those transactions and understand exactly what happened. So the information makes the whole thing a bit more transparent and easier to understand for the user of the financial statements, because these amounts have the tendency to just disappear in the financial statements, and now all that we're doing is we're providing more information so that the user can understand it even better. All right. If we move on to slide number 13, you will see there information about interests in joint arrangements. Remember, IFRS 12 is applicable to joint operations and joint ventures and associates that enables users of the financial statements to evaluate the nature, extent, and financial effects of its interest in joint arrangements and associates, including the nature and effects of its contractual relationship with the other investors, with joint control or significant influence over the joint arrangements and associates, and then the nature of and changes in the risks associated with its interest in joint ventures and associates. Now, these two slides, number 12 and 13, when you start talking about what are the risks associated with its interest in joint ventures and associates, ladies and gentlemen, then you're going to start, seeing that the companies are not so keen to, sort of disclose all of that information. But if you think about that, number one, it does increase the transparency of the financial statements, because the user now knows how much risk there is that spreads out of this whole involvement with another entity. But you will agree with me that this could be sensitive information, because if I say what the risks are for me being involved with all of my subsidiaries might not be so happy about all of the information that I disclose. But in the name of transparency, disclosure is what it's all about. We bring this information to the attention of the user, uncomfortable as it may be. All right, but remember, all of this happens obviously in a professional environment. If we move on to slide 14, you can see there information about interests in unconsolidated structured entities that enables users of the financial statements to understand the nature and extent of its interests in unconsolidated structured entities. That's an easy disclosure requirement. Do you agree? You identify the structured entities that you haven't consolidated, and you basically just give an overall description, and background information about what that entity does, what it was formed for. You're obviously going to also provide information, regarding your professional judgment as to why you decided not to consolidate it. So people are going to have a better understanding of the relationship, i.e. the interest in that other entity, but also the risks. If you look at the second bullet point, evaluate the nature of and changes in the risks associated with its interests in unconsolidated structured entities. So in this disclosure, the entity is going to have to be very honest and have to be very professional about being very honest. Do you agree? And this information, which is maybe information that the entity would have preferred not to provide by means of disclosure, will now have to be disclosed in order to assist the understanding of the average user of the financial statements. To finish off IFRS 12, you can see that those were basically the categories of disclosures, and that it relates mainly to your investments that you hold in subsidiaries, associates, joint arrangements, and then unconsolidated structured entities. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing difficult about IFRS 12. It's very theoretical. Take the slides, study the categories, understand what information must be provided, and if you get examined on something like this, because there haven't been questions on these topics before, I think you have rather an empty canvas that you can paint on, and that you can provide disclosure in any which way that you want, and no one is going to be able to say whether you're right or wrong as such in the format. Make sure that the information that they're looking for is disclosed. I think questions on IFRS 12 on its own are highly unlikely, but I think when you have discussion questions, when you're talking about control, you might refer to the fact that disclosure, is quite tedious and, detailed in IFRS 12, and that actually increases the transparency for the user of the financial statements in respect of these interests. So I don't really think that there's anything difficult or risky for you as a student. I think, once again, all of the information must be provided in the question, and you're just going to have to put it in a note format. You must know what to disclose, what not to disclose, especially your assumptions. And once again, I'm going to emphasize this again. Where you will use IFRS 12 is basically in discussion questions where you're going to deal with accounting treatment. Now remember, in our exam technique lecture in financial accounting that's on the website and on your DVDs, what you must remember is that accounting treatment deals with recognition, measurement, presentation, and disclosure. So when you discuss the accounting treatment of control, for example, okay, that means the accounting treatment of a subsidiary. You're going to be talking about recognition, what is control, etc., measurement, the fact that assets and liabilities are consolidated at 100%, disclosure, what are the line items, presentation, what are the line items on the face of the financial statements, and then lastly, the disclosure. And these will be the types of information bits that you can refer to when you discuss the disclosure relating to subsidiaries, associates, joint arrangements, and then lastly unconsolidated structured entities. So a very nice question would be to give you something like an unconsolidated structured entity. And firstly, just to create the scenario around the structured entity, and to test you then by using IFRS 10 to determine part A, whether this structured entity should be consolidated or not for 10 marks, okay, and create a nice scenario. And then part B, if you assume that the structured entity is not to be consolidated, then what will you do after that? You will then provide disclosure, and this is the kind of disclosure. So give an example of the disclosure, and then we create some information in the question, and then you provide note disclosure relating to that unconsolidated structured entity. But for the rest, IFRS 12 is really simple, straightforward, very theoretical, and it unfortunately means that you're just going to have to sit down and study it a bit until you become more familiar with its requirements. Thank you for viewing the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you in the next one.